discussion. So we'll have a lot of questions and answers because some of the information I'll present I think will raise questions, and it'll be just good if we can sort of talk it out as we go along. One of the things in this book, Anatomy of an Epidemic, it goes through some problems. Why might we need to rethink psychiatric care? And I'll get into that in a second. But there's a solution section at the end, and one of the things that the very first thing I talk about in the solution section is, we all need to become, as a society, better informed about the evidence base for psychiatric medications and what's happening. And then we need to have a discussion about that, a fully informed discussion. And really, I see this event here as part of that. In other words, it can be a start for the sense of, I'm going to present some information that will seem, I think, that you probably haven't heard, but we're going to go through a case study. And then the whole thing is, how can we start thinking about this information? And why don't we know it? And we'll see what happens, okay? But that's the thought here, that I'll talk, but we'll have questions and answers all along, okay? Here's the setup for this whole inquiry into whether we perhaps do need to rethink psychiatric care for this book. If we look at our societal beliefs, it sort of goes like this in terms of psychiatric care. That is, in 1955, thorazine arrives in asylum medicine, and this kicks off a psychopharmacological revolution. All of a sudden, we make this great advance. We get antipsychotics, we get antidepressants, we get anti-anxiety agents. The arrival of the antipsychotic agents makes it possible to empty the asylums. We can now treat the severely mentally ill in the community. That's part of the story of progress. We also hear at some point that these drugs are like insulin for diabetes. They fix chemical imbalances in the brain, and if that's true, you can see what an advance that would be. That would mean that we identified the biological sort of underpinnings of mental disorders, and now we have drugs that are antidotes for that, so that's obviously a story of progress. And then if you follow the story of progress forward a bit, in 1987 we get Prozac arrives on the market, and this is the first of the second generation psychotropic drugs. In the second generation, we get the SSRIs, then we get the atypical antipsychotics, and they're said to be safer and more efficacious than the first generation. So you see the story of progress, right, unfolding across many years. And in 1998, David Satcher, who was then the U.S. Surgeon General, he wrote a treatise, a long treatise on mental health, and he basically summarized this story that I've just told. He said, prior to 1955 in psychiatry, we lacked treatments that would prevent people from becoming chronically ill. Okay? Now we got these medications, and now we can prevent the chronicity. And that's the story of this great advance that pretty much we as a society believe in and governs our care. So what I did is, as a starting point for this book, is look at the number of people on government disability due to a mental illness. And I tracked it from 1955 forward. Because, of course, if we have indeed made this progress, you might see disability rates at least staying the same, or perhaps even on a per capita basis going down. Because if you get drugs that prevent chronicity, you might expect this sort of reduction in morbidity, etc. So here's the numbers. In 1955, there were about 560,000 people in state and county hospitals, mental hospitals, excuse me. But if you actually dig into that data a bit, about 200,000 of the people in those hospitals were not there with psychiatric conditions. They were there with Alzheimer's, alcoholism, end-stage syphilis, that sort of thing. So if you look at the number of people with a psychiatric diagnosis, it's about 360,000 people. And that's a disability rate of 1 in every 468 people in the United States at that time. Now, the way other researchers, this is not my metric, have sort of tracked the number of disabled mentally ill forward into the deinstitutionalization era, is look at the number of people on SSI and SSDI once we got through this process. SSI and SSDI are the government disability programs, and look at those numbers who are there because of a mental disorder, mental illness, okay? You go forward in 1987, it is 1.25 million, which is a disability rate of 1 in every 184. So obviously an increase in the disability rate. Now, we may be comparing, obviously, apples to oranges. Maybe, to be hospitalized in 1955, you have to be much sicker than you have to be on SSI and SSDI in 1987. So it's an inexact comparison. It's the only one we have, but it's inexact. Now, 1987 is the year we get Prozac, and remember now we get the second generation psychiatric drugs, right? And it's also when we really embrace this paradigm of care. Just so you know, in 1987 we spent about $800 million on psychiatric drugs in the United States. Now we're spending more than $40 billion a year. So this incredible increase in spending. And now what's happened to the disability rate, SSI and SSDI, since that time? In 2007 it topped 4 million people. That's 1 in every 76 people now is on disability due to mental illness. The number of people going on SSI, SSDI every day now is 850 adults. That's 365 people per day. In terms of people going off, very few come off for work, and there may be many reasons. So you just see this incredible surge, okay? And also, just real quickly on the children, because of course children can end up on SSI due to mental illness. In 1987, there were 16,200 children on that list. Today, there are 600,000. And that's increasing at the rate of 250 children per day. And if you follow those 250 children, if you follow that group as they move forward, pretty much when they hit 18, they're going right on to the adult disability roles. And the other thing you find when you look at the disability is a new cause of disability. Before, it was mostly psychotic illnesses. What's really driving the increase now are the mood disorders, in particular depression and bipolar. So among the kids, in fact, I shouldn't say among the kids, among those 18 to 26 on SSI and SSDI now, over half have a mood disorder, 56%. It's only 44% that are on there for psychotic disorders. So this is a big switch. Now, you can see, and I'll ask the question pretty quickly, but to me this raised a question. It proves nothing. It just raises a question. So we have this belief system and this understanding that we've made this great progress in treating mental disorders. We have drugs that prevent chronicity. And I do say this, we all know people that have been helped in acute crises by medications, and we all know people who in fact have stabilized well on them. So in our personal experience, we know people who are helped by medications. Nevertheless, when you look at this disability data, and this is what the book does, it does raise a question. And that is this. Is it possible, for some unforeseen reason, that our drug-based paradigm of care is actually fueling this increase in disability? It's a legitimate sort of scientific question to raise. And once you raise that question, you have to investigate two other questions to figure out if it could be contributing. One is, how do psychiatric medications affect the long-term course of major mental disorders, say depression, schizophrenia, anxiety, bipolar disorder? And we'll talk about what the evidence base is for medications, but what we really want to see as we investigate this, and I do this in the book for those 4 major disorders, is, are we improving on the natural course of the disorder? Are people more symptomatic than before or less symptomatic? Are they more likely to work or less likely to work? Those sort of big picture questions that might affect the disability rates, okay? And that's an investigation, I think, that's really never been done. I really think this is the first book that really tries to answer, how is this paradigm of care affecting long-term course of lives? And also looking at employment rates, etc. Now, the second possibility here that we have to be sort of aware of that could be fueling this disability rates is it possible that you can have a person come into the system with a mild problem, let's say a mild bout of depression, okay, get put on an antidepressant, and they're going to have a bad reaction to that drug, and let's say they have a manic reaction to that drug, and now all of a sudden they're shoved into the bipolar category, and now they've moved from a milder problem that probably would have naturally cured up on its own, but now they're into a more sort of a serious state. And obviously we know that bipolar today, medicated bipolar, often does end up on disability. So that's another thing to look at as we look through the evidence base. Now, I just want to say in terms of, so what is the value system in this book and how I approach this whole task? As Catherine said, I've been writing about medicine and science for a long time in different forums. And it has always been the sense that, as hammered into me, is you do want to understand what's the evidence in the source documents, okay? So this is a mainstream value. By the way, there was a period when I was actually director of publications at Harvard Medical School, and we always talked about evidence base. So this, as you go through this book, and what we're going to do today as a case study, is we're going to look at studies by the NIH, World Health Organization, major groups that sort of bear on this question of long-term outcomes, and we're just going to see what they say. But this is what happens when you do a book like this. People immediately put you into a certain camp and wonder if you're anti-med or something like that. No, I'm pro-med in this sense. I'm pro-best use of meds. And that's really what the sort of thing we're going to be doing here today. All right, any questions on that? I mean, any sort of sense of do you see the validity of this sort of approach and the need to take this? Okay, good. All right, real quick question before we go into a case study of neuroleptics. Can anybody tell me, we'll even start with neuroleptics. How do antipsychotics work? Anybody know? How do, in a real physiological sense, how do they do? What do they do?
Well, they used to be thought to block dopamine receptors.
And
Now I think the belief it's evolving. So I think it's altering characteristics of the postsynaptic receptors and everything else.
okay.
I don't think it's figured out.
Okay, that's pretty good. And what causes schizophrenia? What is the biology of schizophrenia?
Well, the old thinking was there was an excess of dopamine activity.
Okay, and do you think... Right, and what did they find?
It's more complicated than that.
That's actually a pretty good answer. All right, why did I do that? Because, of course, this sort of metaphor that drives the use of these drugs, that we understand that they're antidotes, is that they fix chemical imbalances. That's the story we were told. So, for example, depression is caused by low serotonin, and therefore the drugs up serotonin, and they're sort of an antidote to that biological problem. You absolutely gave the story about schizophrenia. Drugs block dopamine, and it's caused by, and that's fixing a dopaminergic hyperactivity, so to speak. One of the things I think we need to do is be very clear as to what is known about the causes of these disorders and how the drugs, in fact, do affect the brain. And the chemical imbalance, excuse me, just for a second. The chemical imbalance theory of this, understand where that came from, that hypothesis. It actually arose in the 1960s, and it arose from two parts. One was, but both instances, it arose from an understanding how the drugs worked on the brain as opposed to an understanding of anything that was happening in the patients. So, for example, in the 60s, they did come to understand that antipsychotics, Thorazine and the others, thwarted dopamine transmission in the brain. And they saw this because people got Parkinsonian symptoms, which is caused by an absence of dopamine. And so they said, aha, we theorized that people with schizophrenia have too much dopamine. Okay, it was to put it into this sort of antibiotic model of disease. The other main one had to do with antidepressants. They found which neurotransmitters the antidepressants acted on. And just to make this simpler, one of them was on serotonin. Okay, the idea is it keeps the serotonin in the synaptic cleft longer than normal, and therefore the theory arose that people with depression had low serotonin. All right? Now, valid hypothesis. But you have to understand is we do not see at this beginning moment of the revolution some sort of discovery about the biological nature of mental disorders. And often revolutions happen in care when you do make such discoveries. But that's not what happened here. What we got these drugs introduced via various pathways, and then we hypothesized that they fix chemical imbalances. Now that theory was investigated in the 1970s and early 1980s. And I'll do the low serotonin story to say how it was investigated and what they found. Because it actually fell apart in about 1984. And here's how they investigated it. If you remember, if we figure out how neurons communicate, let's say we have the presynaptic neuron, right? It releases serotonin into the synaptic cleft, and that serotonin binds with receptors on the postsynaptic neuron, right? Now, to terminate that signal, the serotonin has to be removed from the synaptic cleft pretty quickly. And that's done in one of two ways. It's either taken back up into the presynaptic neuron, or an enzyme comes along, breaks it into metabolites, and those metabolites are carted off as waste. Now, those metabolites show up in the cerebral spinal fluid. So researchers said, aha, we have a way to test serotonergic levels in the brain. Theoretically, if people with depression have low serotonergic activity, they should have low levels of metabolites in the cerebral spinal fluid. Okay? So they did those studies in the 70s. And they took samples and then measured the amounts of these metabolites. And here's what they found. They found that metabolite levels were actually quite variable. And they were sort of a bell curve. In other words, you'd have a group of depressed patients at sort of low amounts, the group in the middle with average amounts, and then a group at the high end. Okay? Then they did the same thing with, quote, normals, people who weren't depressed. And what did they find? The bell curve was the same. Okay? There was no statistically significant difference. All right, so then they said, there was one little thing. There was one group of researchers who did this that said, but aha, in this group in the low end of serotonin, in that bell curve, we saw more suicidality. So maybe there's a subset of depressed patients that have low serotonin. Okay, even though their bell curve for everybody was normal, maybe we can still have this subset in the low end. And they said, maybe this is, as you know, not everybody responds to antidepressants. They said, maybe this is the group that responds to antidepressants. So the NIMH ran a trial in 1983-84 where they did metabolite levels of the depressed patients. The hypothesis was that it would be the people with the low end who would respond best. And here's what the drug they were using was a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. Okay, Prozac wasn't on the market yet, but nevertheless they had such a compound. Okay, and again, so they're focusing on this one neurotransmitter. And here were the results. It didn't matter. The people at the high end of the metabolites were just as likely to respond to the drug as to those at the low end. And so the NIMH concluded in 1984 that elevations or decrements in the serotonergic system per se do not seem to be involved in depression. And that actually was the low serotonin theory of depression falling apart in 1984. There were, of course, other sort of inquiries, research done after that, after Prozac came to market, but they have never found a low serotonin theory. I mean, evidence that indeed is the case. Same thing happened with the dopaminergic thing. Do people with schizophrenia prior to being medicated have high overactive dopamine systems? No. They did this with other disorders. And I think it was in 2005, Kenneth Kendler, who's the co-editor of a magazine called Psychological Medicine, he summarized this whole long history, and he said this: we have looked for big, simple neurochemical explanations for mental disorders, and we have not found them. Okay, so the point is, we still don't know what the biology is behind these various disorders. Okay, that's the first thing, all right? So the chemical imbalance story, in fact, fell apart. Then the other question is then, how do the drugs act? How do they act on the brain? And let's go back to Prozac, because this actually was fleshed out in the early 1970s or early 1980s, and here's what they found. So how does Prozac work? Remember, the serotonin is released into the presynaptic cleft. Part of that neurotransmitter then is reuptake, is brought back into the presynaptic neuron via a reuptake process. There's channels. Prozac blocks those channels, and therefore the serotonin stays longer in the synaptic cleft. Okay, that's why it theoretically ups serotonin levels. It stays longer, can bind longer with the postsynaptic receptors. But what does the brain do in response? The brain has this incredibly flexible neuroplastic organism, and frankly, it immediately says, "Uh-oh. This is a problem that the serotonin stays too long in the synaptic cleft," and it begins to go through some adaptations. And the adaptations are twofold. The presynaptic neurons actually put out less serotonin, okay, at least for a time. And then second, what happens is the receptor densities on the postsynaptic neuron decline. They decrease. The serotonergic neurons become desensitized to serotonin. So physiologically, you're driving the brain into a low serotonin state with the drug. Now you can see what's happening. Think of it this way. The drug is putting down the accelerator on serotonergic activity. The brain responds by putting down the brake. It's trying to maintain a balance, they say. Researchers will call this synaptic resilience. It's trying to retain its normal functioning. And if you look at, say, neuroleptics, antipsychotics that block dopamine receptors in the brain, that's a brake. The brain does the opposite. It puts down the accelerator. For a while, the presynaptic neuron pumps out extra dopamine, and you will get an increase in the receptors on the on the postsynaptic receptors. In 1996, Stephen Hyman, who was a neuroscientist at that time, head of the NIMH, summed up all this research. And you know what? This is pretty darn good research. It's pretty beautiful research to figure out how the drug acts on the brain and how the brain responds to it. So it's really 40 years of research that comes to fruition. And what Steve Hyman does in a paper called Initiation and Adaptation, a paradigm for understanding psychotropic drug action. And by the way, a lot of the studies I talked about today I've put up on a website. You can go read these studies for yourself. He says this: how do these drugs work? They perturb neurotransmitter systems in the brain. And in response to this perturbation, the brain undergoes compensatory adaptations. And at the end of this process, the brain is functioning in a manner that is both qualitatively and quantitatively different than normal. Okay, and that's neither bad or necessarily good or bad. It's just quite a bit different from a metaphor, which we've told patients for many years, that these are fixing known chemical imbalances. In truth, we don't know what's wrong, And after you're on the drug, in fact, your brain is changed in a manner that is both qualitatively and quantitatively different than normal. It's functioning in a bit of a abnormal manner. Okay? And as we go through the literature, we might see why this ends up as a problem. And that's actually one of the things I think is important, to conceive of the drugs in an accurate manner. Because once you conceive of the medications in this way, I think you do see the possibility that maybe these medications might be problematic over the long term. Okay? And also why that maybe you might have very variable responses to the medications, because again, we're not fixing anything that's known to be wrong. It's just it doesn't fit that antibiotic model. Okay? Real quickly, any questions on that before we do a case study? Does this sound, I mean, I guess my question is, did y'all know this, or does it seem surprising? Alex.
I have a question about the low serotonin theory.
Right.
I remember reading about experiments where they feed people a special diet that artificially lowers their serotonin levels, and you find that a certain percentage of those people become depressed on that diet. What do you think is going on there?
Well, this actually was part of the reason that the low serotonin theory was advanced. And had to be, in particular, the drug. Anybody heard the drug Reserpine? It's an old Indian herbal drug, and that actually will lower serotonin. Okay, and there was reports that when they gave this to patients, that caused depression, and that was one of the reasons they floated the hypothesis. But then when they actually looked at this research better, they found that it was just as likely to be an antidepressant. Yes, some people became depressed on Reserpine, but many people actually got better on Reserpine. So in other words, it was a very variable reaction. And that's sort of been reviewed now as part of the sort of sense that this theory did not pan out. Any other questions on this? Okay. I hope that's clear, right, in terms of what's going on? All right, what I thought I would do then, in the book I go over, again, the long-term outcomes literature for schizophrenia, depression, anxiety, bipolar, and then also looking at what's happening long-term to children for ADHD, depression, and bipolar as well. But I thought today, because this information can be surprising, can ruffle some feathers, I think, as it was said, we would do a really sort of in-depth look at neuroleptics, the long-term history outcomes literature for antipsychotic medications. And I thought this would be a good one for two reasons. One is, if the story of antipsychotics is at the heart of the psychopharmacology revolution. Okay? These are the drugs that allowed us to empty the asylums. That's number one. Number two, as you know, if you get diagnosed with schizophrenia, you are told you should take these medications for life. This is something we all know for a fact. And third, our society, in fact, is geared up to deliver the medications to people so diagnosed, even if they don't want to take them. So if there should be any sort of literature documenting the merits, the long-term merits of a class of medications, it should be there for antipsychotics, because that's what we believe. And in fact, if you question this, you're considered a bit of a loony, actually. Okay? So that's why I did that. And the other thing is, you'll see at the end of this, that fortunately, when you go through this literature, there's a best use principle that emerges, and there's practice that's been done successfully. So this becomes a great way to see how evidence-based medicine, in fact, as the title of this talk is, can lead to a paradigm of care that can better promote long-term recovery. So that's why I chose antipsychotics. Two things on this. Emmanuel Stipp, he's a pretty well-known professor at the University of Montreal. And in 2002, he wrote a really interesting article. And the article was about the evidence base for psychiatric medications and for neuroleptics. I think the thing was titled sort of on the anniversary of the discovery of Thorazine, something like that. And he said, first of all, about the neuroleptics. He says, after 50 years of using neuroleptics, can we even answer this question, are neuroleptics effective in treating schizophrenia? Can we really answer that? And he said, when it comes to long-term evidence, there just is no good evidence that they are indeed effective. He says, he's not saying they're not. He's just saying, I looked, I couldn't find that evidence. And other people said the same thing. And then what he did, Emmanuel Stipp said, he went to sort of this larger question of the evidence base for psychiatric medications, and he said this: if we wish to base psychiatry on evidence-based medicine, we run a genuine risk in taking a closer look at what has long been considered fact. And in essence, that's what we're going to do here today with the antipsychotics. That's what I do in the book for many classes of medications. And my point is this: this is mainstream medicine to take this closer look. It's something that someone like Emanuel Stipp is saying we should be doing. And what you'll find also when people who are in this business try to find evidence that medications, say antipsychotic medications, improve the course of schizophrenia for the better, they couldn't find it. Doesn't mean they didn't. Doesn't mean he found harm. He's just saying we just don't have the evidence showing we're improving the long-term course of schizophrenia. Okay? So how do we do this investigation? What is the first thing we need to try to flesh out? Any ideas? How are we going to figure out how the medications affect the long-term course of the disorder? Any thoughts on what we first got to know?
Look at different indexes, such as how often are they hospitalized, how well are they functioning.
Yeah, that's going to be good in terms of as we go forward. Absolutely, in terms of sort of outcome measurements. I think we need to go back even before medications, and we got to try to figure out. We got to look at epidemiological data. What was the course of schizophrenia, say, from 1945 to 1955, in the decade before the introduction of thorazine? And that will give us a little bit of a look at what is, quote, the natural course of schizophrenia. All right? Or at least what we're trying to improve upon. So what do you think was the course of schizophrenia in studies from 1945 to 1955? What's your understanding of what was the natural course? Anybody? Okay. Okay. Okay, so the two you're saying. Any sense of they break down into numbers? Okay, I'll give this. I have to tell you, I was quite surprised by this epidemiological data because my understanding, of course, was that most everybody so diagnosed became chronically ill. That basically recovery was quite rare. Here's the data. Which I don't seem to have. Oh, yeah, here I do. Sorry. Okay. Here's one study. This was a study done at Warren State Hospital in Pennsylvania from 1946 to 1950. It looked at first episode psychotic patients, and 62% were discharged within 12 months. At the end of 3 years, 73% were out of the hospital. And by the way, if they're living out of the hospital, there's no disability network at that time. Okay? In other words, they're going back to their homes. Many are going back to jobs. Many are going back to marriages. Another big study was done at Delaware State Hospital. It found that 85% of 216 schizophrenia patients admitted between 1948 to 1950 were discharged within 5 years. And on January 1, 1956, this is 6 years after the initial hospitalization, 70% were successfully living in the community. Okay? Yeah, go ahead.
Well, there's an old clinical, I think it was Boiler, who said a third recover.
Right.
A third can recover somewhat, but can live independently if they're impaired, and a third are very chronically ill for the rest of their lives. That's
Well,
clinical.
well,
20 years before.
Well, no, actually, and then there was another observation that in England at this time that pretty much supported that idea. And now in England in this period, 1945, they were diagnosing schizophrenia more narrowly, so their group of patients was actually sicker than the ones that we might have been talking about here in the U.S. studies. But anyway, there in England during this time, they indeed found a one-third, I think it was 33% were completely recovered 5 years later, and another 20% enjoyed a social recovery, which meant they could work and live independently. That meant over 50% of schizophrenia patients in England from 1945 were getting out and were living independently and working 5 years later. Okay, and that was with the narrower definition as well. So it's not quite, the spectrum of outcomes is quite heterogeneous, and it's not quite just this dead-end chronicity that we thought was happening. Real quickly, just in terms of the part of the neuroleptic story is that neuroleptics is what enabled us to empty the asylums, right? There's two bits of data on this. If you look at California, did a big study about discharge rates in 1958. It's the only type of study we have of this sort. Of all their first episode schizophrenia patients from, I think it was 1956 to 1957. And they looked at, not everybody was being medicated at that time, and they just looked for discharge rates for the two groups, those that got medicated, those who did not. 88% of those not treated with medication were discharged within 18 months. Only 74% of those treated with medication. They also found that in hospitals that used medications more, they had lower discharge rates than the hospitals that hadn't adopted such heavy use of the antipsychotics. Now, obviously, maybe the unmedicated patients aren't as ill. We got all sorts of questions. But the only thing is, in this data does not show that it's the medications that is making at least the discharge of first episode patients possible. The second part is, did it enable the release of chronic patients? Well, the number of chronic schizophrenia patients hospitalized in 1955 was 270,000 people. In 1963, it had declined by about 17,000 people, roughly the same number. The discharge of patients, of course, begins after we start providing Medicare and Medicaid. We provide federal funding for the discharge of patients to nursing homes, that sort of thing. It really was a financial thing. Okay, so that part of the thing you can really see really is a myth that it was the drugs that enabled people to live outside the community. All right, what is the evidence base for neuroleptics? If a psychiatrist was up here today, he'd say our evidence base is solid, there's no question about it, and there is an evidence base, and it consists of two parts. Anybody know the two parts? Anybody here? What it is? Okay, first part, of course, is the efficacy of the drugs in curbing acute episodes of psychosis. So you do studies. Let's say we have 100 newly psychotic patients. We put 50 on drug. We put 50 on placebo. And 6 weeks later, we look at see in which group psychotic symptoms have abated more. And sure enough, it's in the drug-treated group. Okay, and that's pretty steady. So that shows that the drugs, in fact, are effective in knocking down target symptoms. And that says it makes sense to use them in the hospital. Okay, and there are a lot of studies of this sort. All right, and that's the one half the evidence base. Now, once they have people on medications, what do they have to figure out? Should we keep people on medications? So they began running what are known as relapse studies. And relapse studies are designed like this. They take patients that are good responders to the drugs. Okay, and they've got to be good responders because otherwise they would be symptomatic. And then in one group, we have 100. We withdraw the drug abruptly in 50. And yes, most of the trials were abrupt withdrawal, not gradual withdrawal. And in the other, we maintain the people on the drugs. And what do we see? We see regularly that the people abruptly withdrawing relapse at much higher rates. Okay? And so that was seen as evidence that the disease is coming back in those taken off their medication. And therefore, the drugs prevent the return of the disease. Okay? And that became the rationale for maintaining people with schizophrenia on drugs long term. Okay. Anybody see a possible flaw in this evidence base? Right. Obviously, that's number one. That's a big one. And believe it or not, there are very few gradual withdrawal trials. And the difference starts to disappear in gradual withdrawal trials. But there's another, you're absolutely right. That's the big hole in it. And you can see it right away. Okay? It's really not telling us that these drugs are preventing relapse. The other thing is, where in that evidence base is there evidence that you're helping people get jobs? Stay off disability. It's not there, right? And there's another problem. Let's imagine, if going back to what is the natural course of schizophrenia. Now let's imagine we have 100 newly diagnosed patients, okay? First episode patients. Let's put 50 of them on drug, and 50 of them we're not going to expose them to drug at all. And then we're going to follow those patients for 3 years. We're going to look at employment rates and how often they're symptomatic and rehospitalization rates. Does this tell us what happens to the never exposed group? The evidence base? Excuse me. Okay, in this trial we would have a never exposed group. Does the evidence base that exists tells us what's happening to that group, the natural course of the disorder? It doesn't, because everybody in our evidence base has been exposed to drugs. Does that make sense? Okay. And we're going to see as this long-term sort of story plays out. It's a very confusing, perplexing, paradoxical one. And it has a lot to do with what's happening to the brain. All right, so the very first study that established the efficacy of neuroleptics was conducted in the early 1960s by the NIMH. It was a 9-hospital study. It was led by a guy named Jonathan Cole. It had 4 arms. 3 of the groups got drug. The 4th was placebo. Okay, and at the end of 6 weeks, the drug-treated patients were doing better. And this was the moment, actually, the people at the NIMH said, these drugs aren't major tranquilizers. They're anti-schizophrenic. They're fixing something. They're fixing something in the brain, apparently. Okay, so that's the start of the evidence base. The study is still cited today. Now, a year later, they came back and looked at rehospitalization rates for the 4 groups. And they were startled by their findings. because it was the placebo-treated group that had the lowest rehospitalization rate. Now, their medication use was not controlled for after that first 6 weeks when they were discharged. So we really don't know how many people that were on drugs went off drugs, how many on placebo went on drug after hospital. So but you do get, in this very first study, the possible hint of a paradox. And the paradox is this, is that drugs that are effective in knocking down psychosis over the short term may, for some reason, make people more vulnerable to relapse over the long term. Okay, now this shows up at the very first moment of the long-term literature. This is the first one-year outcome study. Okay? Does that make sense? This little bit of paradox? Okay, the next study were relapse studies of a different type. These were also done by the NIH. They were done in 1968 and 1971. Basically, they took schizophrenia patients and withdrew them all from their meds. Okay? And then they looked at how much dosage they were on prior to being withdrawn from the meds, and then looked at how frequently they relapsed. And what they found is relapse was significantly related to the dosage you were on. So the more Thorazine you were on, or the more Haldol you were on before withdrawal, the more likely you were to relapse. The lowest relapse rates in each instance was those who, in fact, for whatever reason, were being kept on placebo in the hospital. This goes to your point, apparently that withdrawal, in fact, can be a factor in relapse. And then the other possibility I think you see here is that it's as if more drug is causing a greater change in the brain for some reason, and that is making you even more vulnerable to relapse when that is withdrawn. Okay? I don't really, they just said there's a significant relation, but we've sort of got a problem. All right? Now, after that occurred, a guy named Bach Open at Boston Psychopathic Hospital, he said, maybe we should reconsider. This is on, and by the way, again, you can read these studies. You can go to madinamerica.com or robertwhittaker.org, and you can read the actual studies so you can see how they were designed, what the nuances of the results were, and you can trace this history yourself, and you can see whether, what you think you make of it. Anyway, he said, I have outcomes data from people treated at 1947, 5-year outcomes data without drugs, obviously, because the drugs hadn't been introduced. And at that time, they were using sort of an intensive psychosocial care in Boston Psychopathic Hospital. And he said, well, what happened? At the end of 5 years, 45% of the patients at the hospital had not relapsed in the following 5 years, and 76% at the end of 5 years, this is back in the 47 cohort, were living successfully in the community. Okay? Now he looked at the drug-treated cohort from 1967, and he says only 31% of those patients remained relapse-free for the next 5 years, and that this group at the end of 5 years was much more socially dependent, much less likely to be able to work and function independently. So here's what he concluded. Rather unexpectedly, these data suggest that psychotropic drugs may not be indispensable. Their extended use in aftercare may prolong the social dependency of many discharged persons. Okay, and again, what we're going to try to see here today is whether this data, the long-term data, paints a consistent picture, right? Does it all add up to something sort of basically a problem? But does it add up? Does it all tell the same story? And here we have a type of study in which we compare modern outcomes to 47 outcomes, and we see for some reason lower employment rates in the modern era, all right, and actually higher relapse rates. Does that all make sense? Okay, next thing. And by the way, I'm basically, how did I do this? I just followed the major landmarks in NIH research, all right? It's not like I'm missing anything. I just went through the history. Okay, this was done in 65, this is done in 68, this is done in the early 70s, etc. Okay, this was concerning enough that the NIMH funded 3 trials in the 1970s that were meant to sort of reconsider whether antipsychotics are absolutely necessary in treating first episode schizophrenia or first episode psychosis. By the way, there have been very few trials of this sort. Okay, we had the one at the initial 1962 thing. There was one called a May study. I can talk about that in a second. And then there are these 3 studies done in the 70s, and that's about it. Okay, and here was the design. And we'll go by these studies one by one. The first, and here was basically the design of the study. we take newly diagnosed patients, and we're either going to treat them conventionally with neuroleptics. I mean, we're going to put everybody on neuroleptics right away. And its other arm is really going to be a selective drug use. We're not going to put everyone on meds right away. In fact, we're not going to put anybody on meds right away. And we're going to see, can the psychosis abate in some patients without the meds? And then if it doesn't, then we'll use the meds. Okay, so it's really a delayed initial use of neuroleptics. And if people never need it, they start getting better, then we just won't put them on. Okay, so it's a little bit different. And the other thing to understand is it's not a placebo group in terms of what they are doing a lot of other things to support the patients. It's sort of intensive psychosocial care, community care, etc. So it's, can you treat patients without neuroleptics while providing a lot of psychosocial support? Okay. All right, one was done in-house by William Carpenter. I don't know if you recognize that name. He's still a real big name in schizophrenia research. It was an in-house study initially, and what he found was at the end of 1 year, only 35% of the non-medicated patients relapsed within a year versus 45% of those treated with medication. Relapse rate was higher for the medicated group. He also noted that the medicated group suffered more from depression, blunted emotions, and retarded movements. We all know why. Those are drug-related. And then he did something really interesting. He interviewed the patients that had gone through the experimental arm and said, well, what was it like to go through psychosis without drugs? And here's what they basically told him. They said, it was hard. It was painful. It was miserable. And it was gratifying and informative. So what the patients said is they felt something, they learned something through that process, and in that way actually better prepared them sort of for the next stage of their life. And what Carpenter and Thomas McClash concluded, is, quote, the medicated patients didn't have that same learning experience, and thus over the long term, it appeared they are, and here's the quote part, they are less able to cope with subsequent life stresses. Okay, so this is, again, an in-house NIMH study. It's the second one that sort of has the sense that maybe we're not shifting outcomes for the better in the aggregate. Okay, does that make sense? All right, next study. The second one was also NIMH funded. It's done by Maurice Rapport at the University of California. Oh, did you have a question? I'm sorry. Yes, thank you. I want to stop now. I was hoping for a question. Right.
And I guess I'm wondering, when you talk about people relapsing when they're on the drug, are they having psychosis as a part of that relapse, or is it something else? And then the people who are off the drug, do they still experience these symptoms like voices or psychosis?
Right.
And do they just cope with it, or do the symptoms stop? Or is there any studies on it?
I hope there's a lot more questions like this. This is a great question, and it actually now goes to your sense. So how is relapse measured? It's usually measured by return to hospital, okay, at least at this time. So could someone be out of the hospital and still having voices and not be considered relapsed? Yes. So that's a really good question. It may be that they're just handling the voices better. They've still got the psychotic symptoms, but for whatever reason, they're not going back to the hospital. But generally, relapse has been defined as return to hospital in schizophrenia studies. Okay? That's a great question. You had a question. Right. 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 No, listen, no, that's great. I mean, what you're starting to explore is some of the nuances here, right? And so you're exploring some of the nuances of this research and some of the other questions that may that may affect outcomes. So, for example, looking at when Bach Open looked at what happened to his 47 cohort versus his 67 cohort, you can come up with an alternative explanation as to why the outcomes are worse in 67, because the social environment is different. He's absolutely right on that. And so my point is, we're going to see if all this research sort of at least tells a picture, but we need to be aware of those sort of caveats, et cetera. And that's absolutely a caveat that's a possibility. Right. Yeah. Right. Right. Well, yes. This is a big problem in psychiatry, is diagnosis, is consistency even between hospitals, between places, and then consistency across time can be so variable. You're absolutely right. The only thing is, at least in this particular study we just talked about, it was one facility, right, all diagnosed by the same group of people. So at least in this one study where we had the lower relapse rate in the non-medicated patients, it's that's confined to one sort of environment. Does that make sense? So we don't have the diagnostic problem in that particular study. But big time, of course, we have a lot of problems with diagnosis. And you have another question?
You did say initially that the people who were not medicated in that initial group were the people who were not really very symptomatic.
Oh no, excuse me. That was in if we looked at just the general discharge rates in California, right? Maybe what the explanation is, those not on medications aren't as sick, and that we're not really comparing the same thing. In this group, this was a randomized study. The one that I just talked about, NIMH, that was randomized. They were just randomized, but thank you, either into let's say, selective use arm or into the conventional arm. So that was a randomized study. Yeah.
In that particular study, did the people that were medicated, did they also receive the same psychosocial?
Great question. Yes. So there was this, I think they called it milieu therapy, et cetera, so they did. So they were trying to isolate, in fact, the medication. But great question. Yeah.
And this doesn't speak to the piece specifically on medications, but it was only 1999 that it was officially recognized in this country that recovery from serious and persistent mental illness, in fact, is possible. And you go back to the 50s and go forward, and even today there are many professionals that don't believe that, that the whole attitude shape around serious mental illness was individuals really. The goal is to stabilize them, contain them, and there was certainly a strong attitude of not working. There was no work first while you're in treatment attitude. And I think that the other piece that I think helps to influence the statistics on SSI and SSD is that, even today, it's over 600 days from the time you file an application to the time that you actually get a first approval or denial to get onto SSI, SSD with very legitimate reason. And it's only been the last few years that there's been options for individuals on SSI, SSD to go back to work part-time without and maintain medical coverage, Medicaid, without losing that entirely and having to go back through a process that might take them 2 or more years. The fear factor for individuals on SSI, SSD, long-standing, to return to work is something that we have to work very hard with, even with now options.
Right.
And it's a huge barrier. So when you look to compare how many people went back to work on SSI, SSD, I do think that over years there's been other factors that have influenced that.
I agree. I agree, of course. What's that?
Stigma also. There are not a lot of employers who are saying, you have a diagnosis, come on down, we want to hire you.
Right. I agree, but hold on just a second, okay? One of the things we are looking at here, though, is whether the system we have in its many forms, medications, et cetera, and expectations, is it producing good long-term recovery, and however we want to define recovery. And I thought you actually have something really key here, is we became very pessimistic about severe mental illness. And we said sort of the best hope you can have is this sort of chronic course and, almost funneling people onto disability. And one thing you want to discover is, was it possible in the past people to go back to work that had psychotic episodes? And so maybe one of the things we're going to and all these are great points. It's a complicated question, okay? But one of the things I think you're already seeing here, and we'll go forward, is that a lot of people were descending into psychosis back in the 40s and 50s, and whatever was happening, for whatever reason, cultural reasons or whatever, they were getting out and they were going back to work. And they were getting married, etc. And one of the nice things to rediscover in this process is that possibility. In other words, we might not have to be telling all our patients that have a psychotic episode at age 20, wow, you're going to have this for life. Sorry about that. Wow, your life's going to be, dimmed. Well, maybe that's not true, and that's one of the things we can discover. And you're right, I'm sort of focusing on medications here because, of course, we have said that medications prevent chronic illness. And there may be many factors happening here. But what we're going to start seeing here is, at least in these studies, we're not seeing that the medications are improving that return to work or that sort of thing. Okay? But we are going to see also another possibility rise here in a couple seconds. And it's not going to be me who's going to raise it. It's going to be none other than William Carpenter and the NIMH, okay, about this chronicity. But I love these questions. And again, as I was talking at lunch today, the whole point is to go over this data, right, and see other possibilities, okay, to think about these things, and maybe we can rethink about, can we get more people back to work? 'Cause I think most of us would agree that it would be better to go back fully to work if we could make that happen, as opposed to a life on SSI and SSDI. It would be better if they had if people were in relationships, more relationships, whether it be married, whatever it might be. You actually see a lot of marriage back in the 1950s with people diagnosed with schizophrenia. You don't see that nearly so much today. So, go ahead.
Well, I was just wondering, we have a bias in the United States toward pharmaceutical implementation. And I was wondering, did you look at international data?
We're going to be on international data real soon.
Because I looked at it, and I went and I looked at India and Greece, and I found out that people were hospitalized on a very short-term basis with medication relief. And they indicated that people went back into their culture. They were able to work. They were able to get married. They were able to regain socialization skills without medication. And apparently, once in a while, they would be readmitted to the hospital, stabilized during episodes. But the episodes were no greater than readmission in the United States on full-time medication.
She's right. You're stealing my thunder, but you're right. No, that's fantastic. No, that's part of the story we're going to put together. But think about the optimism there. Okay, so what's happening there? They're stabilizing people. They're getting them out of the hospital. They're not keeping on medications. I think we all know that antipsychotics can dim sort of motivation, that sort of thing. And here we see in other cultures a different use of medication. And what are we seeing? Just what you said, people going back into cultures, more marriage, more employment, that sort of thing.
And I don't know about the plausible, but historically, one of the side effects is, quote, brain damage.
Well, we'll get to this of what's happening with the atypicals, okay? So we're going to see what's happening long term because there's some new MRI data that we do need to confront, okay, with the atypicals as well. Great stuff. All right, next thing, we're going to keep going with these three studies. The second one was done by a guy named Maurice Rapport at the University of California, San Francisco, 1978. He randomizes 80 young male schizophrenics either to hospital, to drug and non-drug groups. And here was his outcomes. Only 27% of the patients treated initially without drugs in the hospital relapsed following discharge, compared to 62% of the medicated group. So just in terms enlarged, the medicated group had much higher relapse rate as a whole. Okay, and only two of the so he had 41 patients treated in his experimental arm. Okay, and at the end of 3 years, 24 of those 42 had never been exposed to medications. All right. And it was that group of 24 patients that had by far the best outcomes. All right? And in fact, of the 24, that only 2 relapsed within that 3-year period. So what that study seems to tell you is that there's at least a subgroup of those treated with that have a psychotic episode or schizophrenia episode that can recover, get better and stay better without medications, and that may be the group that will have the best long-term outcome. It's a possibility from this. Here's what he concluded. Our findings suggest that antipsychotic medication is not the treatment of choice, at least for certain patients, if one is interested in long-term clinical improvement. That's very different than short-term. Many unmedicated while in hospital patients showed greater long-term improvement, less pathology at follow-up, fewer rehospitalizations, and better overall functioning in the community than patients who were given chlorpromazine while in the hospital. Okay, second study of this type, and at least it favors the using drugs selective model. And the reason it favors that is it appears that there's a group of patients that can get better and don't need to be medicated. All right? The third study was done by Loren Mosher. Loren Mosher was head of schizophrenia studies at the NIH at this time, so in this sense he's the head schizophrenia doctor. He ran a program called Soteria House. It was pretty much a randomized deal. And I think this was meant to have people with schizophrenia that had a poor prognosis. In the experimental arm, they went to a house staffed by ordinary people who were just empathetic, that sort of thing. They were non-professionals. The others were treated in the hospital conventionally. And at the end of 2 years, the Soteria patients had, as a group, lower psychopathology scores, fewer hospital readmissions, and better global adjustment than those treated conventionally with antipsychotics. So as a group, the selective model of drug use, again, produced better care. Now, maybe it was just the fact that the house was better. But anyway, because the other group did not get the same housing care. Okay. But here, what was the drug use? 42% of Soteria patients were never exposed to antipsychotics in the 2 years, 39% on a temporary basis, 19% on a continual basis. So he found only about 20 needed to be on the drugs regularly. He said, this is Mosher, contrary to popular views, minimal use of antipsychotic medications combined with specially designed psychosocial intervention for patients newly identified with schizophrenia spectrum disorder is not harmful but appears to be advantageous. We think that the balance of risks and benefits associated with the common practice of medicating nearly all early episodes of psychosis should be re-examined. So you see in these three studies sort of the same basic conclusion. If you're looking at long-term outcomes, maybe you want to use drugs selectively. Okay? Real quickly, and I'm getting a little bit behind here. At this point, William Carpenter raises a problem. He says, there is no question that patients are less vulnerable to relapse if they are maintained on medications. Let's see if I can get this right. Let me get this right. I'll do it, quote. There is no question that once patients are placed on medication, they are less vulnerable to relapse if maintained on neuroleptics. But what if these patients had never been treated with drugs to begin with? We raise the possibility that antipsychotic medication may make some schizophrenic patients more vulnerable to future relapse than would be the case in the normal case of the illness. Okay? Normal course of the illness, sorry. And the point of this is he's raising this awful moment. Is it possible that the drugs are actually making people more biologically vulnerable to psychosis than they would be normally? And you can see why this is such an uh-oh moment. Because if that's the case, that's what the drugs are supposed to treat. All right? And this is really a moment of crisis for psychiatry. It comes in 1978. The father of American psychopharmacology this year, Jonathan Cole, who ran that very first trial we talked about, he writes a paper titled, Is the Cure Worse Than the Disease? And he recommended in 1978 that every schizophrenic patient in the United States be given a chance to go off their medications. Now, he could not do that today, but that was his conclusion. And he emphasized to caregivers, we mean this, he said. Everybody should be given a chance to go off. So there was this moment of crisis. Now, the crisis deepens in the next couple of years because there were guys from McGill University that put together a biological explanation for what was happening. And here's what they said. Neuroleptics work by blocking 70 to 90% of dopamine receptors in the brain. Okay, a particular receptor called the D2 receptor. In response, the brain increases the postsynaptic neurons increase their density of D2 receptors. The drug acts as a brake on dopaminergic activity. The brain puts down the accelerator. Okay. Now, what happens when you remove the brake in the withdrawal trials? You're really out of balance. And these dopaminergic pathways start going like this. And it's because you've caused this change. And they said, they said neuroleptics, this is what they concluded, can produce a dopamine supersensitivity that leads to both dyskinetic and psychotic symptoms. An implication is that the tendency towards psychotic relapse in a patient who has developed such a supersensitivity, he's talking about these extra dopamine receptors, is determined by more than just the normal course of the illness. They said this is what's happening with the withdrawal. This is why they're relapsing, and they're getting such severe relapses. Okay? But then they said, okay, it's bad to come off. We have this change. What happens if you stay on the drug? Now you got this problem, in essence, it seems like. The brain now has the accelerator down, brake down, and you can imagine a car driving a car like that. It puts some stress on the machinery, so to speak. And they found, of course, that you started getting tardive dyskinesia in 5% of patients a year. And what's the sign of tardive dyskinesia? It's a sign that the dopaminergic pathway to the basal ganglia, which controls motor movement, is in fact becoming dysfunctional. Okay, it's breaking down. It's no longer carrying those messages. This comes at the rate of 5% a year. So after 5%, 10%, this is with the old drugs, 15, etc. But what these guys said, Barry Jones and Guy Chenard said, well, if you're getting tardive dyskinesia, there's actually 3 dopaminergic pathways in the brain. There's one of the basal ganglia, there's one of the limbic system, there's one to the frontal lobes. If we're getting dysfunction in the basal ganglia, aren't we going to get dysfunction in the limbic system? And the limbic system, they said, is associated with psychotic symptoms. And are we going to get dysfunction in the frontal lobes, which might be associated with cognitive decline and dementia? And they basically said, if this tardive process sets in the limbic system, we're going to see schizophrenic symptoms becoming more severe in this group of patients. And they did research, and they said that they called it tardive psychosis, sets in at the rate of about 3% a year. In other words, instead of 5% a year, it's cumulative. They looked at a group of 216 patients that had been chronically treated. They said 30% now showed signs of tardive psychosis, where the psychosis had sort of settled in on a permanent basis. And they concluded, when this sets in, they said, the illness appears worse than ever before. New schizophrenic or original symptoms of greater severity will appear. So you can see how problematic this is at this moment. Not only are we maybe making people more biologically vulnerable to relapse, which is a problem, but we may be making people sort of permanently psychotic. And these symptoms are becoming more and more severe. So that was the red flag raised in about 1982. And there was a guy named a Danish doctor, I think it was a Danish doctor, no, a Swedish doctor, Lars Martinsen, who gave a pretty famous talk at the World Psychiatric Association. He said, holy mackerel, have we looked at this research? It looks like our drugs are like it's like putting a psychosis-inducing agent into your brain. And there was just this horrible moment of the paradox from drugs that worked over the short term, in fact, might be making people really chronically ill on the target symptom over the long term, at least some people. Now, after that, discussion stopped. You can see, I mean, this is a real threat to psychiatry. It either has to revisit its use of drugs or it has to ignore this, and they chose to ignore it. And it's actually at this time we start getting the statements that people with schizophrenia have to be on drugs for life. E. Fuller Torrey makes this statement, and we actually now as a society, right after this moment, come up with the law that basically says all schizophrenia patients need to be on meds for life. Anybody who suggests otherwise is a loony bird, and our society is going to do it. It wasn't evidence-based, that decision. At least I think that after reviewing what we've done. And we have, by the way, there's one other study, I'm running late. Nothing I can find contradicts that's the story we've seen in these studies. Okay, real quickly in terms of confirming evidence. It really comes from two... Oh, I know I've got to finish up this part in 5 minutes so I can move on. Real quickly, MRI studies. What they show? They show that, in fact, these psychotic agents over time cause a swelling of the basal ganglia. They call a shrinkage of the frontal lobe. At the University of Pennsylvania, they looked at whether that changes in brain were associated with an improvement of symptoms or a worsening of symptoms. They found that as these changes occurred over 3 years, you get a worsening of positive and negative symptoms. So think of this. Agent comes in, morphological change, and you're actually getting an increase of symptoms. There was another study by Nancy Andreasen, same sort of thing. She's been studying 500 patients. She's the former editor of the American Journal of Psychiatry. She finds that, indeed, over time, the drugs shrink the frontal lobes. As that shrinkage occurs, you get cognitive decline and you get an increase of negative symptoms, and it's dose-related. Okay, it's another sign of an iatrogenic process. 3 real quick long-term studies, observational studies. Courtney Harding did a study where she followed patients from the backwards of a Vermont hospital. They were released in 1950s, 1960s. She followed up, looked how they were doing in the 1980s. In one way, it was good news. Roughly 34% were completely recovered. As she said, however, all of those completely recovered shared one thing: they had all long since stopped taking their medication. Another study of this was the one you were talking about. There was actually several of these international studies. One was done by the World Health Organization. It compared outcomes in India, Colombia, and Nigeria with outcomes in the U.S. and 6 other developed countries. They do one 5-year study. They find that the outcomes are much better in India and Nigeria, dramatically better. So they redo the study. They say, how can this be? It's a 2-year study. And they hypothesize that, in fact, I bet it's the medicated patients. I bet the reason for the better outcomes in the poor countries is that they take their medications more reliably. So they studied medication use. And what did they find in that study? They found that only 16% of the patients in the poor countries were regularly maintained on medications. In the developed countries, that was the regular standard of care. By the way, they concluded in that study that living in a developed country was a strong predictor that you would never fully recover from schizophrenia. Okay? Finally, we have a long-term outcome study done by Martin Harrow at the University of Illinois College of Medicine. He followed a group of, he's NIH funded, he followed a group of 64 schizophrenia patients diagnosed at 2 Chicago hospitals, early 70s, late 80s. He just follows them forward for 15 years. He looks at them at 1 year, 2.5, 4.5, 7.5, 10, 15. He looks at whether they're working. Are they asymptomatic? Have they been in the hospital? Are they on and off medication? He finds that after 2 years, it's the unmedicated group is doing slightly better than the medicated group. Not extremely a lot better, but a little better. And it's over the next 2.5 years that the divergence in outcomes really happens. By the end of 4.5 years, the recovery rate for those off medication is 40%. Those on medication is 5%. By the way, and those off medication, it was more than 60% were working, whereas very few of those on medication were working. That divergence in outcomes stays forward through 15 years. At the end of 15 years, 40% of those off medication are recovered. Only 5% of those on medication are recovered. The other thing you notice from Harrow's study, he actually has 3 outcomes. He has recovery, so-so, terrible. In the off-medicated group, only 16% are in the terrible category, so it breaks down 40% recovered, 44% so-so, 16% in the terrible group. In the medication group, it is 5% recovered and roughly 47% each in the poor and the okay and the poor, so they're much more likely to be chronically ill as well. Harrow appeared at the 2008 APA conference, and he told them, I conclude that patients off antipsychotic medication have better long-term global functioning. Okay, that's sort of real quick history of research. Now, what does this tell us? And then I'm going to get on to some of the other disorders. Catherine's going, move on, move, keep going. Get the children. But you see, it's a case study. But here, real quickly. All right, go ahead. Absolutely. And this is part of my complaint is we need to have this information. You all need to know it. You need to make it known so we can have a more informed discussion. Last thing, you know how that study is being presented to residents in training, the Harrow study? So if you read the most recent APA textbook, because it's so prominent, they have to say something. They do not say anything about the data. They say the Harrow study shows that there are few schizophrenic patients that can do okay without the continuing benefit of medication. That's how they sum that up. So they put this into a benefit story. Yeah?
Do you have any idea how Newsweek got away with publishing a cover story of depressing stuff?
Well, that study actually had been out for a number of years. Yeah. I don't know. That's a good question since the magazines are so heavily supported. I was shocked by it because it has been out there for a long time. Irving Kirsch's work is not new. But finally, I guess they said, we can't ignore it. It was amazing. Real quickly, evidence-based reform, then we'll move on to some of the others. What do you see in this history? You see that if you want to maximize long-term outcomes with first episode patients, you don't immediately put them on neuroleptics because you want to see if there's a group that can escape without going that drug-medicated path. And that is a note that comes real clear in that literature, right? All right? And that's not an anti-med thing. That is a best use of med, and it's what the evidence base shows. Finland began using, not all of Finland, Western Lapland and Northern Finland adopted that use of medications along with heavy psychosocial care in 1992. They now have by far the best outcomes in the Western world, and here are their outcomes with their first episode patients. At the end of 5 years, 85% are working or back in school. Only 15% are on disability. Of that 85% that are working or back in school, their unemployment rate is lower than the unemployment rate for the community at large, the Finnish community at large. The other thing that's happening is schizophrenia is now disappearing in Western Lapland. The reason is they used to get roughly 30 new cases of schizophrenia a year. That's a very high incidence of schizophrenia for a population of 70,000. Why is it disappearing? They're getting these first episode psychotic patients. Oh, I forgot to, I'll get back to medication use. And they're not progressive. They're not having psychotic symptoms for 6 months. So very few now are becoming chronically ill and therefore ending up with the diagnosis of schizophrenia. Here's their medication use. After 5 years, only 33% have ever been exposed to antipsychotic medication. Only 20% are regularly maintained on the drugs. And last thing in terms of drug use, do they use benzodiazepines? They use benzodiazepines in the initial part to help people sleep. Okay, so it's actually very much a medication policy, but this is how they've done. Okay, real quickly, other things and get to the children. If you look at antidepressants and what happened, if you flesh out the epidemiological research for depression in the pre-antidepressant era, you will find that people say people are going to get better. It may take 6 months, 8 months. They're going to recover from this bout, okay, with great regularity. And that maybe it's more like a flu. You're going to get better. You're going to become euthymic. Maybe another episode will visit you in 2 years, 3 years. Maybe one won't for 5 years. It's very much an episodic illness, but you can expect to recover. Given that fact, the idea was that antidepressants would be used to accelerate that recovery rate, make it happen faster. They start using antidepressants, and it's really interesting to see what happens. Right away, doctors start saying, now these are doctors who are used to the course of unmedicated depression, and they start saying, wow, you know, our patients aren't getting better faster, but they're relapsing more frequently now. And all of a sudden they're coming back. The cycle duration is happening sooner. So right away you see this worry about chronicity. The chronicity starts showing up in epidemiological studies. People are relapsing much more. In 1992, a guy named Giovanni Fava from Italy said, hey guys, we need to confront this. It looks like there's this paradox. The drugs work over the short term, but they're depressogenic over the long term. A guy named Ross Baldessarinis from Harvard Medical School said, yeah, guys, we need to pay attention to this. It looks like these drugs are depressogenic. Guy from Columbia University named Donald Klein said, halt. Nobody's interested in this question. He wrote Fava. The NIH is not interested. The FDA is not interested. The pharmaceutical is not interested. Nobody is interested that the drugs are depressogenic over long term. And the way the APA handled this shift, so here's the outcomes today. Roughly 15% of people with major depression will remit and stay well on antidepressants. The remaining 85% end up with sort of a chronic, very sort of recycling disorder. So now we went from episodic to much more chronic disorder. And if you can read in APA textbooks, and like I think it's the 1998 textbook, here's what they say. We used to think that depression had a relatively favorable outcome or a good outcome. Now, new studies have shown that, in fact, it is a chronic and pernicious disease. But what they're really talking about is the course of medicated depression versus what used to be unmedicated depression. They're two different things. Real quickly, there was an NIH study in the 1990s that looked at the course of unmedicated depression over 6 years versus that of medicated depression. Those who got treated were 3 times more likely to suffer a cessation of their social role and 7 times more likely to end up on disability. There's been studies in other countries, Canada, the UK, et cetera, that also show treatment over the long term increases the risk of disability. Real quickly, the deterioration in bipolar outcome. The bipolar story has 2 components. It used to be rare, 1 in 5,000 people roughly. Outcomes were also considered favorable. It would be an episodic illness. You would have a bout of mania or depression. You would recover to what's called euthymia, absence of symptoms. During that euthymic period, you'd go back to work. Employment rates were 85%. No long-term cognitive decline. And then you might get this flu a second time, a third time, whatever. And like 15% would be chronic. But they would tell patients back then, in the pre-lithium era, patients can be reassured that it is not likely this will turn into a chronic condition. Okay, and it's seen as having a good long-term outcome. Same sort of thing. Immediately, doctors say once with lithium, and we're starting to see more relapses for whatever reason. It seems like we're turning it to a chronic course. What is the course of, oh, and I'll get to real quickly how we got up to 1 in 40 bipolar patients, but what is the course of bipolar today? Instead of this recovery to euthymia, there's actually this recovery to sort of a low depressed state. If you look at people on diaries, they're depressed a lot of time. They're symptomatic in between sort of the real flare-ups. They're highly symptomatic. That's number one. Many more episodes. You see a lot of rapid cyclers now. You never used to see rapid cyclers.
Is this what you're saying right now consistent with children?
It's even worse in children. We're going to get children in 1 second, because the children's story is to me quite frightening when we look at the actual data. The other thing you see in bipolar patients today, so more cycles. By the way, at the 2008 meeting, there was actually a session on how the deterioration in bipolar outcomes is so dramatic. You can actually read papers that they talk about this deterioration in outcomes, and here they actually assign it to the use of antidepressants and neuroleptics. The second thing you see in bipolar outcomes today is long-term cognitive decline. You never used to see that. Believe it or not, long-term bipolar outcomes are now merging with long-term schizophrenia outcomes in terms of the level of disability and cognitive decline. And the third thing with cognitive decline, what is it? Oh, employment rates. And employment rates today are about, in terms of functional outcomes, are now about 35% for bipolar patients. It used to be 85%. This huge, huge decrease. The final thing with bipolar patients today, they're burdened with a lot of physical problems, obviously drug-related, obesity, cardiac problems, and now we've got the early death. So the deterioration in bipolar outcomes is astonishing. From 85 to 35%, the cognitive decline. By the way, Harrow's study also basically had a manic-depressive group in it. Two things are notable about that. The manic-depressive patients off drugs actually had a good long-term 15-year outcome. Okay, they ended up basically in the recovered category. The manic-depressive patients that stayed on medication ended up worse than the schizophrenia patients off meds. Those outcomes crossed, which is really pretty dramatic. Why are we getting so many bipolar patients today? How do we go from 1 in 5,000 to 1 in 40? Obviously, part of it is expanded diagnostics, no question about that. You used to have to be hospitalized for each episode. Now you don't have to be hospitalized at all. But you also got you also have two iatrogenic pathways, drug-caused pathways. If you sample any group of bipolar patients, probably 33% have been abusing illicit drugs before they have their manic episode. It's either marijuana, cocaine, hallucinogens, etc., cocaine. That's one iatrogenic pathway. The other iatrogenic pathway is clearly the SSRIs, the antidepressants, tricyclics and SSRIs. When those antidepressants came in, they noticed that the conversion of unipolar to bipolar dramatically, the percentage of unipolar patients that converted to bipolar dramatically increased. It's recognized that the drugs can cause manic episodes. And there was a survey of DBSA members, that's the support group, and 60% of those members said they had their first manic episode in response to an antidepressant. So that's a big reason we're seeing this iatrogenic epidemic unfold. And so when I talked about the increase in disability, now we're starting to see some of the real evidence as to why this drug-based paradigm of care is contributing. Increased chronicity, drops in employment rates, cognitive decline we're seeing, that sort of thing.
Do they know why the SSRIs would have been
Why would they cause people to go into mania?
Yeah.
Well, if you actually go back to the discovery of antidepressants, it's actually an antibiotic. Okay, it's actually a drug being introduced into medicine to treat TB patients. And what happens is some of the TB patients start becoming a little manic. Okay, and they say, if they're rousing people, maybe we can use them to rouse lethargic patients. But the fact that these drugs can cause mania is all the way back from the 50s. It's well recognized. And by the way, Fred Goodwin, the father of American, the bipolar, he's a former NIMH guy. He's the authoritative figure in this field. At that 2008 meeting, he said, listen, antidepressants can iatrogenically create a bipolar patient, and when you create that bipolar patient, it's not so easy to bring them back to sort of baseline. So this is a recognized risk that I think we need to deal with. Yeah.
In your study,
Not my studies, what I review, but yeah.
your research that you've done, are you finding that kids that have been started on Ritalin, because there are many, many, many children that have been started on Ritalin and then come to go to bipolar side?
Yeah, let's go to children, and you're now on.
Can we stay with adults one more minute?
Sure.
Okay, just an interesting point that individuals who have schizophrenia in the United States have a 90+% smoking rate.
Right.
And it would be interesting to look at some of the comparisons of individuals who are on psychotropics and not, because there are two drugs that show strong evidence of reducing negative symptoms. One of them is nicotine.
Right.
And the other is clozapine.
Right.
And so individuals who typically have schizophrenia self-medicate with nicotine. Now that's 75% of the reason why they have a 25-year shorter lifespan.
Right.
When you look at what the different symptoms are. So it's simply an interesting point. I know the Finland study recommended skipping over the earlier antipsychotics and going strictly to clozapine because of the outcomes for that group that
Right.
needed treatment.
Yeah, that was the mortality study, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And so I'm part of operating the largest upstate clozapine clinic. That's a full protocol one here, and we find for individuals who come to us who have failed on other treatments,
Right.
of getting very significant improvements in their life functioning
With clozapine.
with clozapine. I'm talking about high work rates going from 10,000 previous inpatient days to 345 over a 10-year
Yeah.
period. So there are some, and I think the point you're making is that you have to very selectively determine whether or not you're going to use medication.
Right.
You have to try and come up with some way of identifying individuals for whom medication would not be appropriate.
Right.
And we don't have good indicators at this point, although I think there's improvement. But I think more importantly, it's an attitude shift. It's an attitude shift in terms of recovery, the belief in recovery, the belief that individuals should maintain and have goals if they're not working to continue to get back to work. I think there's an awful lot in the field that works against people who have serious and persistent mental illness, expecting of them that they can have goals that are achievable, and whether it's medication or not, that we're there to support them to get it.
Right, and now what I would say on that is, and by the way, clozapine I think is something of an exception. I mean, I wish we had better data on clozapine. By the way, I think one of the reasons they smoke, though, a lot is as an antidote to the drugs themselves, because nicotine is a dopamine releaser. So I think they're self-medicating partially to counter the effects of the antipsychotic medications. One of the reasons it's so high, because those are dopamine blockers. These are dopamine releasers.
I haven't seen a study about those who aren't and those who
Yeah,
are,
yeah.
but it'd be interesting.
But anyway, that's one thought. All I would say is we need to recapture that optimism at the first moment. Okay? At the first moment, and one of the things the Finnish people I did that talk about is they say they give off sense of optimism right from the beginning. You're going to get better. You're going to get your life back. You're not going to be a chronic mental patient. And you can see what a better start that is. Right from the beginning, this isn't necessarily a lifelong illness. And you can imagine how much that is reassuring to parents, to the person who's all like, what has happened to my life? What's going on? And so that sense of hope, excuse me, is right from the beginning of it, and it's central to what they're doing. And the only thing in terms of, you're right, we do need predictors, but in the absence of predictors, maybe what we need to do is with the first episode, we just have to let and see if some people can escape. We need that escape hatch. Children, real quickly, let's go to children, because the bipolar story in children is a frightening story, I think, for the reason you said. I'm going to go real quickly with the ADHD story in terms of the long-term outcomes. We have short-term evidence that they do some behavioral responses that at least teachers appreciate, okay? But in terms of, and that's really what the data shows, it's still certain behaviors. In 1994, roughly, I forget the exact year, but the NIH got ready to mount the first well-controlled sort of long-term study of stimulants for ADHD. And it was meant to see, does this provide a long-term benefit? Now, as they got ready to mount that study, they said, at this point, We have no evidence that stimulants improve long-term functioning in any domain. Not school, not ADHD symptoms, not delinquency, not socially. No improvement in any domain. This is basically 15 years. So they were admitting they're starting from a lack of help. So what happens in this study? And they basically compared drug to behavioral therapy. After 14 months, it did seem that the drug-treated patients were doing a little better. Okay, their ADHD symptoms were less, and also I think it was on reading. They were doing a little better on reading. And so this was really seen as a study, a heralded study. Aha, we finally have evidence that stimulants work. They produce a long-term benefit. Okay, and that was heralded in the media and all. But then they kept on following the kids. And now it becomes an observational study. They're just looking, are they on meds or off meds? And what do they find at the end of 3 years? They find that being on meds is, quote, a marker of deterioration relative to being off meds. Not a marker of benefit, but a marker of deterioration. And that's on the core ADHD symptoms. Okay? You also see some stunted growth. I think you see some greater depression and anxiety in the medicated group. So the benefit disappears at the end of 3 years. At the end of 6 years, it's the same thing. Okay? There's some stunted growth, and there's actually greater functional impairment in the medicated kids. The ADHD, there's higher delinquency scores in the drug-treated kids. And a gentleman at your college, William Pelham, was one of the lead investigators of that study, and he concluded this. He's at your university, right?
On his way out.
Okay, but anyway, still pointing.
He's still one of them.
Oh, okay. He said this. He said, we had thought that the children on medications would have the better long-term outcomes. Okay? But that did not turn out to be the case. We found no benefit. None. And we need to make that clear to children. So I would say to you as social workers, as you're involved with having kids medicated for ADHD, you need to know the evidence base. And the long-term evidence base, as far as I know, shows there's no place you can find that it's a benefit for the kids, helping them in school, helping them socially, helping them stay out of trouble. Nothing. If you can find it, I don't know it, but that's what my research showed. Yeah. Yes, that's there too. Yeah, and you basically go to Anatomy of an Epidemic, and then you go into the documents, and you'll see like children's studies. Okay. But now let's look at the risks with ADHD, and you just mentioned this. Okay? What percentage of kids? Well, we know there's like cardiovascular problems. There's actually some brain atrophy with stimulants long term. There's a lot of problems. What's the risk that they're going to become bipolar? Anybody have an idea? What percentage of kids in studies will have a psychotic episode within 20 months of being put on a stimulant? Any guess? Seems about 10% within 20 months. That was a Canadian investigation. What percentage of kids' ADHD will convert to bipolar within 4 years? Any guess? What do you think?
No, I was going to ask that,
yeah.
That 10% that would not have adult psychosis.
Yeah, this is where in the study they said this is definitely drug-caused, drug-induced psychosis. Okay, so here's the big thing with bipolar. If you look at juvenile bipolar, if you look at the case studies when it starts, juvenile bipolar starts to be discovered in the 1970s. Okay, the first sort of case study is 1976, because prior to that they said prepubertal kids just did not get manic depressive illness. They did not get mania. It didn't happen. A guy named, I think it's Weinberg or something, in 76 says he has, I think it's 5 case studies. He says, I think they can get manic depressive illness. And he gives the history. Most of those kids in those case studies had been on stimulants or antidepressants. The next one was out of MGH. Same thing. It was 13 cases. Nearly all had been previously exposed to psychotropic drugs. So the juvenile bipolar boom rises in lockstep with the use of stimulants and antidepressants. Something like, anyway, this is not well quantified, but somewhere between 10 and 25% of ADHD kids within 4 years now convert to bipolar. Okay? Yeah?
Until the 90s, most of the diagnosis of these children were done by primary physicians or by pediatricians.
Right.
Based on information provided by parents.
Right.
In the mid-90s, church, psychiatrists, clinical psychologists, clinical social workers
Right.
found out that many of those children that we diagnosed had potential deficit disorder were manic to begin with.
So you're saying the ones that go on to ADHD, to bipolar, were manic all along, before they ever got exposed to a stimulant?
Sorry?
Before they got exposed to a stimulant?
Well, based on history which have been done about 5 or so years, and introduced by clinical psychologists, psychiatrists, and clinical social workers, people found out there was evidence within the family of Uncle Joe who used to behave that way.
All right, so you're saying there was a genetic predisposition. All right, all I can say is that genetic predisposition didn't used to lead to juvenile bipolar illness prior to the use of stimulants. That's number one. Okay.
We have codified every possible imaginable behavior.
Okay, so you're better at diagnosing bipolar illness. All right, maybe. I will say this, though. Stimulants are known to be able to cause psychosis. Okay? That's well known. All right? So that's a real risk. And and by the way, and then the other thing is antidepressants. They're well known to occasionally stir mania, and roughly about 25% of youth now put on antidepressants have a manic episode and convert to bipolar. In terms of the evidence base for use of antidepressants, virtually all of the antidepressants failed in pediatric populations. Even on the short term, they failed to provide a benefit over placebo. So you don't even have the evidence base for short-term use, and yet you're exposing them to this long-term iatrogenic pathway. Yeah, go ahead. Well, sure. I mean, yeah. Biederman, of course, is the Pied Piper of juvenile bipolar illness, and he's the guy who popularized it. His story is very complicated, but one of the things you'll find is documents, which I have, in which he's promising to Janssen & Janssen, while they're paying him money, I'll get these kids diagnosed ever younger. I'll show that they're going to be chronic patients for life, and that they're going to need Risperdal for life. And you can see that in documents, and I have that document. So when he's doing this, he's saying, I'm going to validate this disorder in younger populations, and I'm going to validate that it's a chronic disorder, and that the patients are going to need Risperdal for life. You make out of it what you will, but he's the guy in 1995 that really kicks this off. And by the way, one of the Biederman study is he looks at the number of ADHD kids that are, quote, comorbid for bipolar. There's actually in that study 11% that didn't have signs of mania prior to being put on a stimulant and then develop it in the first 4 years. Okay? So that's for that. Again, the other iatrogenic pathway, remember, again, I don't have time on this, antidepressants do not show effectiveness generally in pediatric populations in the short term. In the UK, because of that, they've basically banned antidepressants, all except Prozac, in pediatric populations. As Lancet concluded, these drugs are both harmful and ineffective in children. Okay, but now you're also exposing them this risk to bipolar illness. Roughly 25% converts. Harvard Medical School researchers said there's no doubt this can be drug caused, and once this happens, it's hard to get them back to sort of baseline. Now you're on this chronic course. Gianni Faida, she runs I don't know if it's a he or she, runs a clinic called the Luci Bini Clinic for juvenile bipolar disorders in New York City. She found that I think it's 84% of the patients she studied had been they became bipolar after being exposed to a stimulant or an antidepressant. As she said, shockingly, only 10% of that group showed signs of mania prior to that exposure. Okay, so you really have a problem here, because once they get bipolar, as you know, they often get cocktails. And now what's the outcome for juvenile bipolar patients? Do you know what the outcomes are for juvenile bipolar patients? Anybody know? A high percentage... Oh, sorry, Catherine. Okay. That'd be cheating. A high percentage end up rapid cyclers, ultra-rapid cyclers, like 75%. Ultra-rapid cycling is associated with even worse cognitive decline. It means they have very little time euthymic. It's considered a very severe chronic form of the disorder. And if you go into the research literature, they say juvenile bipolar patients are ending up with a severe chronic form of bipolar disorder. They can be expected to have poor long-term responses to drugs. And of course, we know once they're on the medications, these different medications, they are going to be exposed to early death, et cetera, et cetera. That is a story, in my opinion, of a medical tragedy of extraordinary dimensions, because you didn't used to see it. Now we see these two iatrogenic pathways, antidepressants, stimulants. In both of these pathways, the stimulants do not show long-term benefit. The antidepressants really don't have an evidence base for short-term, so why are we using them? And then we end up with kids that are not just bipolar, but severely bipolar. You're making them lifelong mental patients. And remember I talked about the disability data? The kids showing up now with mood disorders? This is the group. They're going right on now all of a sudden to SSI and SSDI when they hit 18. They get this diagnosis, they start having the problems, and now we've got lifelong mental patients. And in my opinion, what we've done is create them with this drug-based paradigm of care. And the research, I've had to go fast, but you can see the pathways. And you see it acknowledged by researchers. Can stimulants cause this? No question. At least some researchers. Antidepressants? No question. And then what? And the bad thing is, if they did okay once they got medicated, diagnosed with bipolar, maybe it would be okay. They have terrible outcomes. Terrible long-term outcomes. And I would say to you all here, and this is actually part of my plea in this book, as to why we as a society need to have this discussion, and why we need to know this evidence base, and what I've explained here. You can go read the book, and you'll see it all there. You'll see it all cited. You can find the bad outcome studies on my website, etc. If this is what the evidence shows, and I certainly believe it is, you make your own decision. Confront the evidence. Figure it out. What are we doing as a society to our kids? Where's the evidence base for putting kids on stimulants when it's not helping them long term and it is exposing them to this bipolar risk? I can hardly think of anything worse, to be taking kids and setting them up for lifelong mental patients. Now, as Catherine mentioned, I'm just an outsider. I'm just looking at the data. I don't really, I did interviews with patients, and certainly I got kids that followed that. But my guess is you see this in your work. You see kids come in with a milder problem, and 2 years later, they're in the bipolar camp. And you really need to ask yourself, would they have been in that bipolar camp if you hadn't medicated them? I mean, you make the decision, but I do think it's an extraordinarily important moral question, and why we're here today. And I do hope, someone asks, what's the solution? I think the solution is that we become familiar with this evidence base that, in fact, psychiatry, pharmaceutical companies do not make known to the public. And the back.
I'm sure you've heard various criticisms of your conclusions.
Sure.
What do you think the most valid ones are of your analysis or your conclusions? What are the weaknesses that you see in what you said?
What a great question. I'm going to have to think a second. What's that? Well, no, I'm thinking. There's got to be. I know what you mean. I should know my weaknesses. Well, no, but the problem is, so for example, in terms of the criticisms, they're straw men. I'll give you an example. This is actually one of the problems. I'll give you an example, okay? I wrote this paper, which we basically have here on the antipsychotics, that was printed in a medical journal, and it was called the 50-year record of antipsychotics. Printed in a medical journal, and the British Medical Journal then picked it up as one of the most interesting stories of the week. Then the British Journal of Psychiatry contacted me and said, we'd like to have a debate. I say, that's fantastic. That's what we should be having. And they couldn't find a psychopharmacologist that would do the debate. So the problem is honestly, I haven't heard a good criticism of, say, the antipsychotic story. Now, the new story that I'm coming out with, which is a much broader one, it's new. It's only a couple weeks. What is and there was a doctor named Dr. Rosen who wrote he trashed me in the Boston Globe. Okay, I think he's a friend of Biederman, but anyway, he trashed me. He prescribes pediatric drugs, etc. Here's what he said, and actually he said, for example, Bob Whittaker uses observational studies, and he's not acknowledging that maybe those who are untreated are less ill than those who are treated. Okay? The problem is this is a straw man. First of all, when I introduce the observational studies, I say, those who are not treated may not have been as ill at the beginning, and they may have a greater resilience. So I give the exact caveat he says. But the more important thing is here, that's just one type of study, the observational studies. In other words, we have perceptions of doctors that were used to, say, treating depression without meds. Boy, they start using it, and you start seeing like, wow, my patients are relapsing more. So that's another type of evidence. We look at the change in epidemiological data. Well, here's the problem. What's that?
Your own criticism, your own doubts.
That's a good... okay, great. Doubts, okay? Because in terms of criticism, I thought I really worked to sort of go at this at every angle. So, for example, could I find anybody that found outcome studies that showed long-term improvement? I really tried to do that, and I thought I had it pretty iron tight. But here's where my doubt comes in. And it's a big doubt, okay? It's an anecdotal doubt. I know many people that do well on meds. It's an anecdotal doubt. That really is. I know many people who've been helped by meds, and I know many people who are doing well on meds, including bipolar patients, including a few schizoaffective patients. So that's my big doubt. It's not. Is it something missing from the studies themselves? Are we somehow, I don't know, are the studies somehow conducted more in a chronic population? Are we somehow missing some of the better responders or something? So that's...
Maybe the question is, for whom is this an effective treatment, rather than is this an effective?
Well, I definitely believe the treatment is effective for some people. And if you even go to the Martin Harrell study, 5% are doing well, right? So that 5%, it's effective for them, I think. You could even say the bipolar patients, the 33% that are working, they certainly perceive themselves as helped. And maybe it indeed is help for that. And maybe it goes back to this. It's all about selective use, figuring out who's better, who's not. But this is my deepest doubt, is that sometimes does the research not reflect accurately the universe of experiences on medications? Because I personally know many, many people who are doing well on medication. Here, and then Nancy, or go ahead. Nancy.
Well, I mean, I think that that's true. The studies don't. The studies are done in clinical settings of people who show up to those settings, those research settings. The people you know, by and large, haven't been treated in most of those systems.
Right.
It's like what we know from alcoholism recovery. We know that lots of people get better on their own in the community, and we never even knew that because they were never showing up in our treatment centers. Well, people are having to seek out treatment specifically for these problems, and yet lots of the people who are on medications that we know were put on them by general practitioners and were never picked up in any of those studies. So it's apples and oranges in the sense of it's a huge question mark about all of the other use of these drugs that never shows up in a study except when people go out and do these massive, general population studies, and those haven't been ones that have even looked at that question of long-term use of medications in people who don't show up in the service system, in the mental health system, but people who are getting them through
Right.
general practitioners, which is the most common form of prescription for antidepressants anyway, and for anti-anxiety drugs.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think this could be a hole in the evidence base. I also think there's also a lot of people that I find that are doing well are people actually that were very high functioning on the SSRIs before. They weren't really what we would call mentally ill. And they had some agitation, discomfort in their life. They go on an SSRI, and 5 years later, they're on a single dose, and they find it helpful. I'm not quite sure that's even a clinical population to begin with. That's a lot of the anecdotal stuff about how wonderful the SSRIs are as well. But I'm glad you asked that question, because that is my doubt. And now we've heard maybe this is part of the problem, that we're not getting, that the research itself isn't as encompassing as it needs to be.
There's at least 50 studies I've looked at where SSRIs were given to see if they would cause mania.
Right?
About every one of those 50 studies, they did in fact cause mania in a certain percentage of the people.
Right.
My question is, how is it even ethical to perform a study or give a medication that is known to cause that level of damage and trauma to a person to begin with? I want to ask you if you think that that has something to do with the eugenic conception of mental health.
Yeah, no, I don't think it has to do with the eugenic conception exactly. Okay? I don't think that's what's operating here. But I do think something similar is happening here. And that is, well, there's a value system operating here in which the protection of the drugs clearly is seen as more important than making evident known this risk. Because if you make this risk fully known, you're going to cut into the sell of those drugs. So I think there is a value decision operating here that does devalue the people that are treated. I don't think it's exactly a eugenic conception, but I do think it's a sense of devaluing. And for some reason, in mental health, you can cause harm that you can't do with other physical conditions. You can have risk profiles that just wouldn't be allowed with other drugs.
Linda Andre actually used your eugenic conception.
ECT book? Yeah.
She said that the idea is that, well, these people are so bad off that nothing can help them, that it doesn't matter. We hurt them. And that's sort of, she traced that back to that.
Well, there certainly was that element in the 1940s operating when lobotomy came in, that they're really not worth much. And so if we take away their frontal lobes, it can only help. I mean, you can actually read that. That clearly was what was the underpinnings of that period of time. And the eugenic conceptions did go forward into the drug era. I mean, if you see, Thorazine initially is heralded also because it causes a chemical lobotomy, but that's seen as good, not bad. So that sense really does transcend, at least in the beginning, into the psychopharmacology era. Yes, he's had his hand up a long time.
Not as an answer to what your concerns about related to anecdotal evidence, positive evidence. I thought that a lot of the recent research that's gotten so much publicity suggested that the placebo effect is significant as any actual pharmaceutical action.
Right.
And that was pretty good research.
Right.
May help explain some of what we hear anecdotally in much less formal terms. And it would be very difficult to tease that out.
Right. And by the way, I think we misunderstand this part. It's not just the placebo effect when people are getting better on depression. What is the natural recovery rate as well from depression? It's not just the placebo effect. People do recover from severe emotional episodes. So all I can say, going back to this question about anecdotal evidence and all, I do think this is a big question, and I'm sure we all can agree that there are people helped. I mean, we know this. But from a big question, is it working for our society where we place drugs at the centerpiece of care as opposed to maybe an adjunct form of care? And think of how much money we spend. Well, we do have rising disability rates. That's not good. We do know we are funneling a lot of kids onto a life of patienthood. We do have a problem with early death. Spending on mental disorders doubled in the last 8 years. None of those are statistics, society-wide, that tell of a terribly successful form of care. And at the very least, I think they are statistics that say, and maybe we even have the thought that we do have this anecdotal thing to hold on to, is that we need to change this paradigm of care. And again, I think we need to perhaps, and you all need to think about it, is we need to know this research literature, maybe rethink about how we can best help people, and maybe adjust our thinking on medications rather than the centerpiece as more of an adjunct, selectively and cautiously used. Last question, and then I got to get out of here. I mean, she wants to yank me from the stage.
I'm trying to come back to the solutions. I mean, I was struck by, you've mentioned that there, particularly with schizophrenia, people's brains actually could become worse.
Right.
And it seems that the people that we're talking about who are the most vulnerable are probably the poor and the children. So until these studies become well known, what can we do as a solution? If someone's doing poorly, I think the experience of society is, well, let's switch the medication to a different one.
Right.
Or let's give them more medication.
Right.
I've actually interviewed children as an attorney, who've been on a list of 12 medications.
Yeah.
And I'm going, wow. And it just seems like we just prescribe more. And it doesn't seem to me like a psychiatrist is going to say, or any doctor, okay, I gave you a bad medication.
Right.
It might be okay.
No, they don't want to say it.
Really, the real problem with children is not so much the psychiatrist or the pediatrician and the drug companies, it's the parents. You have parents with mild to moderate problems with their child, teachers who won't tolerate mild to moderate problems, and you have parents coming in insisting that rather than non-medication intervention,
And one thing on this, that's great. The solution section, there is a program, a doctor in Eastern Massachusetts that I interviewed, and he is so upset about his early death problem that's coming up in his clients that he is trying to get funding, and the Office of Mental Health in Massachusetts looks like they may give it for a medication withdrawal program. Now, it won't be randomized. This even got started because they surveyed their 1,000 clients, and they said, what is the number one thing you want? And they said, we want support for medication withdrawal. That possibility. In other words, they don't lose their benefits. And they also, he's going to design it that if symptoms flare up, they're not necessarily going to put them back on medication. They really want to see if they can get them through 6 months. So that at least will provide us some evidence about how possible this is, instead of just pouring on more medications, et cetera. He, by the way, same guy, is looking now to start a pilot project based on the Finland study. He's going to go over to Finland and hopefully it looks like he may get funding for that as well. First episode, don't medicate everybody, and we'll just see if we can do that here. And I love this because, it's going to be evidence-based, it's within the system, that sort of thing. Final solution in terms of depression, you know what Britain is starting to do? Because Britain really has now, the National Institute of Clinical Excellence has said to the National Health Service, we don't really see the benefit-risk profile for mild to moderate depression, partly of Kirsch's work. You can now go to your GP and get a prescription for exercise. You come with that prescription, and it allows you see an exercise counselor. It gives you access to a gym. There's also green gyms where you go out gardening together, because one of the ideas also is you do community exercise, that sort of thing. Lots of evidence that shows after 10 months produces a much better response than antidepressants. You also get physical health, a lot of other benefits. And the final thing is they say that patients like it, and they now feel in control of their destiny. And you want me off the stage. Nancy. Yes. Have you seen her? She's been like a fishing pole.